The gunshot did not come from outside. It came from inside Elias Doyle's own chest, somewhere behind his ribs, the moment he watched Elsie Sullivan turn away from him in the middle of the crowded harvest dance and pretend, with every fiber of her quiet, stubborn grace, that he simply did not exist. He stood at the edge of the Sweetwater Grange Hall with a glass of cold water in one hand and 6 years of accumulated silence in the other, and he watched her walk back to her corner table, and he felt the betrayal of his own heart like a brand pressed to skin. The hall was full of women who wanted Elias Doyle to look at them. He knew it. Everyone in Sweetwater, Colorado knew it. It was the great open secret of the 1883 autumn season, discussed in whispers behind the dry goods counter at Hargrove's General Store, and debated in the back pew of the First Baptist Church every Sunday morning. Elias Doyle, owner of the Doyle Creek Ranch, 12,000 acres of prime Colorado grazing land, a herd of 1,800 cattle, and a reputation for being the most quietly decent man west of the Continental Divide, had returned from 3 years of business in Denver, and he was looking for a wife. Clara Whitfield had worn her blue silk dress to the dance, the one she normally saved for Easter Sunday. Margaret Poole had arrived with fresh flowers braided into her copper hair, and laughed too loudly at everything and nothing. Agnes Hargrove, daughter of the general store's owner, had pressed a jar of her famous apricot preserves into Elias' hands at the door with a smile that left no room for misinterpretation. Bella Crane had danced past him 4 times hoping he would reach out and catch her hand. And Elias Doyle had watched all of them with polite, genuine warmth, had thanked Agnes for the preserves, had complimented Clara on her dress, had laughed honestly at Margaret's stories and nodded courteously to Bella's graceful turns. But his eyes kept drifting, always drifting. Back to the corner table. Back to the woman who had not braided flowers into her dark hair or worn silk. She couldn't afford or found an excuse to press herself into his orbit. The woman who sat alone with a cup of coffee going cold beside her hand, reading a letter she had folded and refolded so many times the creases were going white, and who had looked up once, only once, met his eyes across the full width of the Grange Hall, and then looked deliberately, purposefully away. Like he was the horizon, like he was just another thing in the middle distance that did not concern her. And Elias Doyle, who had ridden through 3 Colorado blizzards, settled 2 range wars without a single man dying, and negotiated cattle contracts with men twice his age and 3 times his ruthlessness, felt himself come completely undone by the simple, devastating act of being looked past. He set his water glass down on the nearest table. He was going to talk to Elsie Sullivan tonight if it killed him. He had been telling himself that for 6 years. He had not managed it yet. That was the secret buried beneath the open secret, the hidden motive behind every polite interaction and careful distance. The trap he had built for himself without ever meaning to, the dark past that kept his mouth shut when every instinct told him to open it. Because Elias Doyle and Elsie Sullivan had a history, not the romantic kind, the worse kind, the kind that started with a debt. He made himself walk, one boot in front of the other, across the worn pine floor of the Grange Hall, past the fiddle player and the laughing couples and the long table of pie and corn cake, past Clara Whitfield's hopeful blue silk and Agnes Hargrove's calculated smile, all the way to the corner table where Elsie Sullivan sat alone with her cold coffee and her folded letter and her absolute, complete refusal to need anything from anyone. He pulled out the chair across from her without asking. She looked up. Her eyes were the color of the Colorado sky in the last 10 minutes before a thunderstorm. Not blue, not gray. Something charged and unresolved between the two, and they looked at him now with an expression he had memorized and could not decode, something that lived directly on the border between anger and exhaustion, and he knew with sudden, painful clarity that she had been expecting him to come over here for quite some time, that she had been dreading it, or perhaps, God help them both, that she had been waiting for it. He said, "You didn't eat any of the corn cake." She said, "You came all the way across the dance hall to tell me that." He said, "I came all the way across the dance hall because you're the only person in this room I actually want to talk to, and I have been telling myself that lie about the corn cake for 6 years." The silence that followed was the loudest thing that had happened in Sweetwater, Colorado in recent memory, even though no one else in the room heard it. Elsie Sullivan set down her letter. She looked at him the way a woman looks at a man when she is deciding whether he is telling the truth or laying a trap, and Elias held her gaze and refused to flinch, because he had waited too long and come too far across too many rooms to flinch now. She said, very quietly, "Elias, you owe my family a great deal of money." He said, "I know," she said, "so whatever this is, whatever you're about to say, I need you to understand that I am not going to let that get confused with something else." He said, "I understand that." She said, "Do you?" And he said, "No, not really, but I'd like to." She picked up her cold coffee, took a sip that meant nothing except that she needed something to do with her hands, and she said nothing for a long moment. And outside the Grange Hall, the October wind moved through the cottonwoods along Sweetwater Creek, and the fiddle played a slow waltz that no one was dancing to. He had 6 years of story to tell her. She had 6 years of silence to explain. Neither of them had any idea where to begin. So Elias Doyle reached across the table, not for her hand, not yet, but for the empty space beside her coffee cup, and he set his palm flat against the table the way a man sets a card face up openly without strategy, and he said, "Can I tell you something from the beginning, the real beginning?" Elsie Sullivan looked at his hand on the table. She looked at his face. She said, "You have until the waltz ends." It was 1883, and that was the moment everything started. Or rather, that was the moment everything that had already started for 6 long years finally found the courage to speak out loud. The real beginning was the summer of 1877. Elias Doyle had been 23 years old and newly arrived in Sweetwater with his father's savings, his own stubbornness, and 47 head of cattle. He had driven up from New Mexico in a move that most of the established ranchers in the valley considered either impressive or catastrophic, and were not yet sure which. He had bought 200 acres at the northern edge of the valley where the land was rocky and stubborn and cheap, and he had built a one-room cabin with timber he cut himself, and he had begun the long, back-breaking, magnificent work of turning nothing into something. The Sullivan farm was 3 miles south. Patrick Sullivan, Elsie's father, had been homesteading those acres since 1869, and unlike Elias, who arrived with youth and energy and nothing to lose, Patrick Sullivan arrived with a wife, 2 daughters, and a bone-deep conviction that the land would provide if a man was patient enough and worked hard enough. For 8 years that conviction had held. Not easily, not without cost, but it had held. Elsie was 17 in 1877, the older daughter by 4 years. Elias did not meet her that summer. He was too busy learning how to be a cattleman from scratch, which meant he was too busy making every possible mistake that a young man with more ambition than experience could make, and surviving them and learning and trying again. He met Patrick Sullivan at the Sweetwater Trading Post in September of that year, when both of them were buying winter supplies and ran out of credit at the same counter, and Patrick Sullivan, who was a man of genuine and uncomplicated generosity, had looked at this exhausted young man with cattle mud still on his boots and said, "You're the one who bought the Karcher property up north?" Elias said, "Yes, sir." Patrick said, "How are the cattle?" Elias said, 39 of 47 still breathing." Patrick Sullivan laughed the laugh of a man who had been there himself and said, "Come have supper." That was how it started, not with anything forbidden or dramatic, just a middle-aged farmer who recognized a young man who needed a meal and a conversation, and who had enough to share. Elias came to supper. He met Patrick's wife, Miss Sullivan, a compact, fierce, warm-hearted woman who could cook a frontier meal that tasted like a blessing, and Patrick's younger daughter, Ruth, who was 13 and already full of opinions about everything. And he met Elsie. She was setting the table when he came through the door, and she looked up, and he remembered afterward that his first thought was that she was the most self-contained person he had ever encountered. Not cold, not unfriendly, but wholly herself in a way that made everyone else in the room seem slightly unfinished, like she had arrived at some internal agreement with the world that the rest of them were still negotiating. She said, "You can wash up at the basin outside. There's soap." That was the whole of their first conversation. He washed up at the basin. He came in and ate the best meal he had had since leaving New Mexico. Patrick Sullivan talked about land and weather and the politics of water rights in the valley, and me Sullivan asked questions about his family back in New Mexico, with the directness of a woman who considered privacy a luxury nobody in the frontier could afford. And Ruth asked him 17 questions about his cattle by name, and Elsie said almost nothing, but refilled his coffee cup twice without being asked. And when he thanked her the second time, she just nodded once, briefly, like an acknowledgement rather than a response, and went back to whatever internal landscape she lived in. He rode home under the October stars thinking about Patrick Sullivan's ideas about water rights. He was lying to himself, and he knew it, and he did it anyway. Over the next 3 years, the families became something like neighbors, which in the Colorado frontier meant something significant. Patrick Sullivan's experience and Elias' energy complemented each other in ways that were genuinely useful. Patrick knew the valley's weather patterns and the temperament of the soil, and the unwritten rules of water access that kept peace between homesteaders. Elias had youth and cattle sense, and a ferocious capacity for work that Patrick had begun to lose as his health declined in small, quiet increments that everyone noticed and no one mentioned aloud. Elias expanded his herd, bought more land, hired his first hand, a Ute-descended man named Thomas Waxfar, who turned out to be the finest tracker and cattle manager in the territory, and who became, over the following decade, as close to a brother as Elias had ever known. The Sullivan farm prospered, not dramatically, but steadily, and Elsie, who was 18 and then 19 and then 20, became the invisible backbone of that prosperity. She managed the household accounts with a precision that would have impressed any Denver banker. She maintained the kitchen garden, raised chickens, helped her father with the heavier work when his hands started to fail him in winter, taught herself to read land surveys out of a borrowed book so she could understand exactly what the family owned and what it owed. And on Sunday afternoons, if the weather was good, she would sometimes be found sitting on the front step of the Sullivan farmhouse reading a book, which was the only thing she did that was purely for herself. Elias noticed all of this. He noticed it the way a man notices the weather, which is to say constantly, involuntarily, and with the growing suspicion that it is shaping everything. He said nothing. Because Patrick Sullivan was his neighbor and benefactor, and had become, in some quiet way, the father figure his own father had been too preoccupied with failure to become. And because Elsie Sullivan made it entirely clear, through no particular action and no harsh word, but simply through the totality of who she was, that she was not a woman who needed or wanted to be noticed, or at least that she would not show it. That was the trap, he understood later. The hidden motive he had not examined carefully enough. His own assumption that her self-containment meant indifference, his own cowardice dressed up as respect. The crisis came in the winter of 1880. Patrick Sullivan died in December of that year. He had been sick through the autumn, the kind of sick that looks like tiredness and announces itself as something final only when it is already too late. It was his heart. He was 51 years old. He died on a Wednesday morning with me beside him, and Elsie downstairs starting a fire she did not yet know was pointless. Elias had ridden over when Thomas Waxfar brought him the news. He had stood in the Sullivan doorway and looked at Elsie's face and seen, for the first and only time, something that was not self-contained. Something raw and frightened and very young, quickly covered, quickly rebuilt, but there for one unguarded moment before she pulled herself back together and began making a list of what needed to be done. She was 20 years old. Her mother had no income. Her sister was 16. The farm had a debt, not a ruinous one, but a real one. A $700 mortgage on the south pasture land that Patrick Sullivan had taken out 2 springs ago when the creek flooded and wiped out the kitchen garden and half the henhouse. He had been paying it down steadily. He had another 2 years left on it. The debt was owed to Hargrove's bank, which was, in 1880, controlled by Edwin Hargrove, Agnes's father, who was a man who wore his Christianity loudly and his business interests quietly and believed, firmly and without much self-examination, that these two things were entirely compatible. Edwin Hargrove gave me Sullivan 3 months. He said with great regret and much quotation of biblical principles around stewardship and accountability, simply not in a position to extend the terms. The bank had obligations. He was sure me understood. Me Sullivan did not understand, because me Sullivan was a practical woman, and this was an impractical cruelty dressed in financial language, but she did not have the resources to argue with it. Elsie Sullivan went to Edwin Hargrove herself. She went on a Tuesday morning in January, dressed in her best wool dress with her hair pinned up neatly, with a full accounting of the farm's assets and projected income written out in her clear, careful handwriting. And she presented a plan for repayment that was methodical and reasonable and demonstrated, without any sentimentality, that the farm could meet its obligations if given a 6-month extension. Edwin Hargrove listened politely and said no. He said the bank's policy was the bank's policy. He said she was a very clever young woman. He said she should perhaps consider that the farm might be more than her family could manage now that her father was gone. She walked out of his office and stood on the wooden sidewalk in front of the bank in the January cold for exactly long enough to decide that she was not going to let Edwin Hargrove determine her family's future, and then she walked to the post office and sent a letter to her father's oldest brother in Missouri asking for a loan. Her uncle wrote back in 3 weeks. He could not help. He had his own debts. The second option was Elias Doyle. She did not go to him. She had too much pride and too much complicated feeling about Elias Doyle, who had become, without anyone formally acknowledging it, something more than a neighbor and less than what she sometimes thought about at night when the house was quiet. She did not go to him because she knew instinctively that accepting money from Elias Doyle would change something fundamental in the architecture of whatever existed between them, and she was not ready for that change, and she was not sure she trusted it. She did not go to him, he came to her. Thomas Waxfar had told him. Not because Thomas was a gossip, but because Thomas believed that information that could prevent suffering had a moral obligation to travel, and he respected both Elias Doyle and the Sullivan family enough to believe that Elias would act on it correctly. Elias came to the Sullivan farm on a Thursday afternoon in February, 3 weeks before the bank's deadline. He brought the money, not as a loan. That was the problem. That was the dark past that had been sitting between them ever since. He had brought $700 in gold coin, which in 1880 represented nearly a quarter of everything liquid he had in the world, and he had put it on the Sullivan kitchen table without ceremony, and he had said to me Sullivan, who was the one home, that it was to settle the mortgage and that there was no repayment necessary, and me had stood there with her hands covering her mouth, and Elias had said, "Patrick Sullivan fed me when I was too proud to say I was hungry. This is what I can do." He had been gone before Elsie came home, me had told her. Elsie had stood in the kitchen looking at the gold coins her mother had not yet taken to the bank, and she had felt something enormous move through her that she could not name and was not ready to examine, and then she had picked up the coins and put them in a cloth pouch, and she had felt the weight of $700 and the weight of everything it meant, and she had said, very quietly, to no one in particular, "This is a debt," not to diminish the gift, to protect herself from what it felt like. Because if she let it feel like what it felt like, then the whole careful architecture of her independence, her self-sufficiency, the image she had built of herself as a woman who did not need anything from anyone would collapse. And she could not afford that collapse. Not then. Not with her mother needing her and the farm needing her and Ruth still in school, so she called it a debt. And Elias, who heard through Thomas that she had called it that, had respected it. He had not argued, he had not pushed. He had gone back to his ranch and thrown himself into the work of making Doyle Creek Ranch into something that could eventually justify what he felt when he looked at Elsie Sullivan. And he had waited, because he was fundamentally a patient man, and because he was also, if he was honest, frightened. The years moved. Miss Sullivan recovered her strength and the farm found its footing. Ruth grew up and married a teacher from Alamosa named Harvey Cole, who was earnest and capable and adored Ruth with a straightforward completeness that made Elsie feel something that was partly happiness for her sister and partly an ache for something she could not name. Elias Doyle's ranch grew into what it was now: 12,000 acres, 1,800 cattle, 3 full-time hands including Thomas Walksfar, who had built himself a house on the north pasture and whose presence was the foundation upon which the whole operation rested. Elsie had become the thing people in Sweetwater meant when they said the word practical. She was the woman who kept the farm books for 3 families in the valley. She was the one people brought their difficult letters to when they needed help parsing legal language. She was the one who had organized the school supply drive after the 1882 flood, and who could be counted on to show up with tools and knowledge and competence whenever either was needed. She was 23 years old, and she was the most capable woman in the valley, and she lived alone with her mother, who was slowing down now in the peaceful way of a woman who felt she had done what was necessary, and she did not attend any social function for the purpose of being noticed, and she did not give Elias Doyle any reason to notice her, except that he could not stop noticing her. And now he was sitting across from her at the harvest dance, and the waltz was 3/4 over, and he was looking at her with an expression that she recognized with a shock of cold clarity as exactly what she had been pretending it was not for 6 years. She said, "You have been building up to something for a very long time, Elias Doyle." He said, "I have been working up the nerve for a very long time." "That's different," she said. "Is it?" He said, "It is. Building up to something means you're calculating. Working up the nerve means you're terrified." She looked at him. She said, "Why are you terrified?" He said, "Because I gave your family money and you called it a debt. And for 6 years I have been afraid that you hate me for it, or that you're grateful for it, and I'm not sure which one is worse." That landed. She felt it land. She looked down at her cold coffee cup for a moment, and when she looked back up, something had shifted in her expression, something small but significant, like the change in light in the minute before sunrise. She said, "I don't hate you." He said, "All right." She said, "And I'm not grateful either, not the way you mean." He said, "How do you mean?" She said, "I mean that what you did was generous and it came from something real, and I have known that for 6 years, and I have also spent 6 years refusing to let it make me feel obligated to you, and those are 2 different things, and I need you to understand the difference." He said, "I understand the difference. I have never wanted you to feel obligated to me." She said, "Then what do you want?" The waltz ended. The hall was suddenly loud again, all at once. Conversation and laughter and the fiddle player tuning for the next song, and Elias Doyle looked at Elsie Sullivan across the corner table of the Sweetwater Grange Hall in October of 1883 and said, quietly, clearly, without any calculation at all, "I want to know you. The real you, not the practical one. I want to talk to you like 2 people who are not navigating a debt or a history or everyone else's expectations. I want to start from the beginning, from tonight." Elsie Sullivan picked up her letter, the one she had folded and refolded until the creases went white, and she held it for a moment. She said, "This is from Harvey. Ruth had the baby 3 weeks ago, a boy. They named him Patrick." He said, "That's a fine name." She said, "I haven't been able to stop thinking about it, about the fact that the world keeps moving and making new things, new people, new names." She paused. "I have been very still for a long time." He did not say anything. He just waited. She said, "The corn cake, is it good?" He said, "Agnes Hargrove made it, so it's technically excellent and emotionally complicated." She made a sound that was not quite a laugh but was the immediate ancestor of one, and it was the most beautiful sound he had heard in 6 years. She stood up from the table. She said, "Take me to see the corn cake." He stood up. He offered her his arm, not because she needed it but because it was the gesture that said what he could not say yet. She took it. Clara Whitfield saw it from across the room and put down her punch cup. Margaret Poole saw it and stopped laughing mid-sentence. Agnes Hargrove saw it from the dessert table and felt something that was partly jealousy and partly, very quietly, the recognition that some things are simply inevitable. Elsie Sullivan walked across the floor of the Sweetwater Grange Hall on Elias Doyle's arm, and she did not look at any of them, and she did not need to, and that was the thing that the entire room would remember and talk about for the rest of the week. The corn cake was, as predicted, technically excellent. They stood at the dessert table and ate small pieces of it and talked, not about the debt, not about the dark past or the years of careful distance. They talked about Ruth's son, Patrick, about the letters Elsie had been writing to assist a family on the east edge of the valley who were fighting a water rights claim that Elias happened to know quite a bit about from his own early battles. About Thomas Wauxfar's recent marriage to a Ute woman named Sarah, who was pregnant with their first child and who had, Elias said with genuine delight, already taught every hand on the ranch to make something with flatbread that had permanently ruined their interest in biscuits. Elsie said, "I know Sarah. She helped me with the autumn canning this year." Elias said, "Thomas said she was helping someone in the valley. I didn't know it was your mother," she said. "It's a small valley." He said, "It is. I have spent 6 years acting like it was larger." She looked at him sideways. She said, "So have I." That was the second thing she gave him that night. The first had been the letter about Patrick. The second was this admission. Small, careful, honest. He said, "Can I call on you, properly? Come to the farm, talk to your mother, do this the right way." She said, "My mother is going to be insufferably pleased about this." He said, "Is that a yes?" She said, "Miss Sullivan has been telling me for 3 years that I work too hard and live too quietly. If I bring you home for supper, she is going to take complete and utter credit for all of it." He said, "I don't mind if she does." Elsie Sullivan finished her piece of corn cake. She turned to look at him fully, not sideways, not cautious, full face, those storm-colored eyes with something in them that was no longer quite as guarded as it had always been. She said, "Saturday, come for supper Saturday. Me makes fried chicken on Saturdays." He said, "I'll be there at 6. She said, "Don't bring anything." He said, "I'll bring the preserves Agnes gave me. It would be a shame to waste them." She laughed then, an actual full laugh, unguarded and brief and perfect. He would spend the rest of his life chasing that laugh. He did not know that yet. He suspected it. Saturday came with cold, clear air and a sky the color of hammered copper above the mountains. Elias Doyle spent entirely too long deciding what to wear, which Thomas Wauxfar found enormously entertaining and commented on without mercy. Thomas said, "You're wearing the blue shirt." Elias said, "I'm wearing whichever shirt I choose to wear." Thomas said, "You've changed shirts 4 times. You're wearing the blue shirt because you think it makes you look reliable." Elias said, "It's a shirt." Thomas said, "Blue shirt, Agnes Hargrove's preserves that you're bringing to the woman who is not Agnes Hargrove. You've been planning this longer than you're admitting." Elias said, "Go check on the herd." Thomas smiled the smile of a man who has won an argument without needing to finish it, and went. He drove the buckboard south along the valley road. The cottonwoods had gone gold and rust along the creek, and the Sullivan farmhouse was visible from half a mile out. A solid, well-kept structure that spoke of years of consistent care, white paint that was fresh enough to be intentional. A kitchen garden put to bed for winter but clearly ordered and productive in its season. 2 chickens in the yard. Smoke from the chimney. He knocked. Miss Sullivan opened the door. She was 61 years old, and she looked at Elias Doyle on her front step with an expression of pure, triumphant satisfaction that she did not bother to conceal. She said, "I have been waiting for this visit for the better part of 6 years." He said, "Good evening, Mrs. Sullivan." She said, come in, Elsie, he's here," and he brought preserves. From somewhere inside the house, Elsie's voice said, "Tell him the preserves are not necessary." Me said loudly to Elias. She's been cooking since 3 o'clock. He stepped inside. The farmhouse was warm and smelled of frying chicken and wood smoke and something sweet that he identified after a moment as apple and cinnamon. Elsie was at the stove, her back to him, wearing a dark blue dress he had not seen before and her hair pinned up in that particular way she had that looked effortless and was, he suspected, anything but. She turned around. She looked at him. She said, "Blue shirt." He said, "It's a shirt." Miss Sullivan made a sound in the back of her throat that contained multitudes and sat down in the rocking chair by the fire with her mending, from which position she proceeded to be present in the room, while contriving to appear entirely uninvolved in anything happening in the kitchen. Supper was the best meal he had eaten since Patrick Sullivan was alive. Not because the food was extraordinary, though it was, but because of what surrounded it. The conversation that moved easily, surprisingly easily, between subjects that mattered. Elsie talked about the water rights case she had been helping the Hartley family with on the east side of the valley, a genuinely complex situation involving a competing claim filed by a company out of Denver that was attempting to consolidate water access across 5 homestead properties. Elias had dealt with the Denver water companies in his own expansion, and he listened carefully and then said, "The Hartley family needs to file a prior appropriation claim. If they can demonstrate they established use before the Denver company's survey date, the company's claim is secondary." "Do they have records?" Elsie said. "Martha Hartley keeps everything. I've been through her records already. They have documentation going back to 1871, he said. "Then they have a case. There's a land attorney in Pueblo named Benjamin Cross who handled something similar for a rancher in Park County last year. Won it cleanly," she said. "Benjamin Cross. I'll write to him Monday." Miss Sullivan smiled over her mending. After supper, Mee excused herself to bed with the complete lack of subtlety of a woman who has waited 6 years for something to happen and is not going to let politeness slow it down now. And Elsie and Elias sat at the kitchen table with coffee that was actually hot and talked until the fire burned low. He told her about Denver, about the 3 years he had spent consolidating the ranch's finances and negotiating contracts, and why he had gone and what had changed while he was there. Not just the business, but what it had done to him. How living in a city for 3 years had clarified, with startling precision, everything he valued about the valley and the mountains and the life he was building. She told him about the years he had been gone, the flood of 1882 and what it had cost the valley, the school crisis when the county had threatened to close the Sweetwater schoolhouse, and she had organized a petition that went to the county superintendent with 47 signatures. The morning she had woken up and realized she had not read a book for pleasure in over a year, and had made herself sit on the front step for an hour with a novel regardless of what else needed doing. He said, "What was the novel?" She said, "Jane Eyre." He said, "The part that stayed with you." She was quiet for a moment. She said, "When Jane tells Rochester that she is no different from him in soul, that they are equal." She paused. "I read that 3 times. He looked at her. He said, "Elsie." She said, "Don't." He said, "I'm not saying anything." She said, "You're looking like you're about to say something significant." He said, "I'm looking at you. Those are different things." She looked back at him. The fire made small sounds. She said, "This is harder than I expected." He said, "What is?" She said, "This. Sitting here, talking to you like this." She turned her coffee cup between her hands. "I have been very careful for a very long time, Elias. I have known what I thought about most things, and I have known how to manage most situations, and I have been quite comfortable with the idea that I did not need anything that I did not already have." He said, "And now," she said, "and now you are sitting in my kitchen looking at me like that, and I find that I cannot be quite as comfortable with that idea as I was." He said, "Is that a problem?" She said, "I don't know yet." He said, "Can I come back next Saturday?" She looked at him for a long moment. She said, "Yes." He came back the next Saturday, and the one after that, and the one after that. November arrived, and the valley turned serious with cold, and Elias Doyle drove south every Saturday evening and stayed for supper and sat by the fire afterward, and talked to Elsie Sullivan and sometimes to me, who occasionally participated and occasionally fell asleep in her chair, and occasionally did both simultaneously and claimed afterward to have been awake the whole time. The conversations moved through everything. Through history and books and the future of the valley, and the politics of the territory and the proper management of winter feed stores, and the proper management of grief, and the question of whether a person was justified in building walls around themselves to protect something essential, or whether the walls eventually became the problem. It was Elsie who said that. On the fourth Saturday, when the wind was loud outside and the fire was warm and me had genuinely fallen asleep this time, Elsie said, "Do you think walls protect you, or do you think they eventually trap you?" He said, "I think they do both, at different times." She said, "I built mine because I needed to." He said, "I know. After my father died, I had to be the person who managed things. My mother was heartbroken and Ruth was young and the farm needed someone who was not heartbroken to make decisions. So I stopped being heartbroken, or I stopped letting myself feel it as much as I felt it." She paused. "And then that became a habit, and then the habit became a reputation, and then the reputation became who I was." He said, "Who are you underneath it?" She said, "I don't know yet, I'm finding out." He said, "Can I help?" She looked at the fire. She said, "You already are." He reached across the table. This time he did not put his hand beside hers. He put his hand over hers. She looked down at it. She turned her hand over, slowly, carefully, and laced her fingers through his. Neither of them said anything for quite a long time. Miss Sullivan, who was definitely awake, smiled in her chair and did not say a word. The water rights case for the Hartley family became a genuine battle in December, when the Denver company sent a representative to Sweetwater, a polished man named Cullen Ward who wore a city suit and spoke the language of legal inevitability with the smooth confidence of someone who had found that confidence very profitable in the past. Cullen Ward did not expect Elsie Sullivan. He met her at the Hartley farm on a cold Tuesday morning, where she was sitting at the kitchen table with Martha Hartley's documentation organized into a clear, annotated record of prior use going back 12 years. And he began his standard presentation about the unavoidability of consolidated water management in a developing territory. And Elsie listened to the whole thing without interrupting, and then said, quietly and precisely, "The prior appropriation doctrine has been recognized by Colorado courts since territorial days, and the Hartley family's documentation of use predates your company's survey by 6 years. Mr. Cross in Pueblo agrees with that assessment. We have already filed." Cullen Ward looked at her. He said, "And who are you?" She said, "The woman who just told you your claim has no standing." He recovered quickly and tried a different approach, which was to suggest that the Hartley family might be better served by accepting the company's offer of a usage easement rather than engaging in costly litigation. Martha Hartley looked at Elsie. Elsie said, "The Hartley family does not need an easement on their own water, Mr. Ward. They need the company to withdraw its claim. If it does not, Mr. Cross will file for an injunction within the week." Ward left. He filed a counter motion with the county clerk that afternoon. Elias heard about it by evening, because Thomas Waxfar had been in town and had the information with the usual completeness that Thomas brought to all things, and Elias was at the Hartley farm by the following morning. He said to Elsie, who was there again reviewing the counter filing with Ben Hartley, "I know 2 of the men on the county commission. Both of them owe their grazing rights on the Eastern Range to a precedent that came out of the same prior appropriation doctrine. If this case goes to the commission before it goes to court, I can make that argument clearly." Ben Hartley said, "You do that for us." Elias said, "I do it because it's right. And because if a Denver company can push you off your water this year, they'll come for mine next year." Elsie looked at him. There was something in her face that was new. Or rather, something that had always been there was new in how openly she was showing it, a kind of recognition, a warmth. She said, "You should come to the commission meeting Thursday," he said. "I was already planning to," she said. "Good." The commission meeting was held in the same Grange Hall where the harvest dance had been 2 months before. Half the valley came, because nothing got people out of their houses in December like a fight about water. Cullen Ward was there with a local lawyer named Prout who spoke loudly and cited national progress. Elias Doyle spoke for 22 minutes with the kind of quiet, structured clarity that comes from a man who knows the land and the law and the people in the room, and is not trying to impress any of them, just trying to make them see what is true. The commission voted 3-1 in favor of the Hartley family's prior claim. Cullen Ward, to his credit, recognized a wall when he hit one and withdrew the company's claim the following week. Martha Hartley hugged Elsie in the Grange Hall doorway and cried. Ben Hartley shook Elias' hand and couldn't quite find the words. Elias was looking for Elsie. He found her outside, standing in the cold December air, her breath visible in the lamplight from the hall windows, watching the stars over the mountains with an expression of quiet, complete satisfaction. He stood beside her. She said without looking at him, "Thank you." He said, "You did most of it." She said, "We did it." He said, "Yes." She turned to look at him. The cold had put color in her cheeks and her eyes were very clear, and she said, "Elias, I want to ask you something directly and I need you to answer me directly." He said, "All right," she said. "What is this? What are we doing?" He said, "I think you know what we're doing." She said, "I want to hear you say it." He said, "I am in love with you. I have been in love with you for more time than I want to admit out loud, and I have spent most of that time being very quiet about it out of respect and partly out of cowardice, and I don't want to be quiet about it anymore." She looked at him. She said, "I have been very afraid of this." He said, "I know," she said, "not of you, of myself. Of letting this matter to me, because things that matter can be taken away, and I have had things taken away, and I am not entirely sure I know how to do this." He said, "Neither am I entirely," she said, "but you came to the dance." He said, "I came to the dance." She said, "And you kept coming on Saturdays." He said, "Every Saturday." She said, "I kept a lamp on." He looked at her. She said, "On Saturday nights. I kept a lamp on in the kitchen window so you could see the house from the road, so you would know someone was awake waiting." He said softly, "Elsie," she said, "I love you too. That is the terrifying thing I am telling you." He reached up and touched her face with one hand, gently, the way a man touches something he has wanted to touch for 6 years and is still not entirely sure is real. And she did not pull back, and he kissed her once, briefly, cold-lipped and careful and full of everything that 6 years and $700 and a lamp in a window contained. She put her hand against his chest. She said, against his lips, "We're going to need to tell me." He said, "She already knows." She said, "She's going to be unbearable about it." He said, "I know," she said, "I don't care." He said, "Neither do I." Miss Sullivan was, as predicted, completely unbearable about it. She was also deeply, quietly, brilliantly happy, in the way of a woman who has watched someone she loves carry a loneliness she was not supposed to notice, and who is now watching that loneliness lift. And she expressed this happiness by cooking enormous meals and talking about Ruth's baby Patrick, and asking Elias extremely pointed questions about the ranch's financial health that she dressed up in casual conversation with a subtlety that fooled no one. Christmas of 1883 was the first Christmas in many years that Elsie Sullivan did not feel like the person holding everyone else together. She felt, for the first time in a long time, held. It was a strange and wonderful sensation. January brought cold that settled into the valley like a presence, and Elias came on Saturdays still, but also on Wednesdays now, and Miss Sullivan greeted him at the door with the proprietorial satisfaction of a woman who considers herself personally responsible for everything good that is happening. He proposed on a Sunday afternoon in late January. He had not planned a grand gesture. He had, in fact, planned almost nothing, which was perhaps the best thing he could have done, because what happened was entirely real and unperformed. They were walking along the frozen creek at the edge of the Sullivan property, bundled against the cold, talking about the spring planting and the water situation and Ruth's letter from last week in which she had described baby Patrick's first genuine laugh, and Elias stopped walking. She stopped too. She said, "What?" He said, "Marry me." She looked at him. He said, "I don't want to be across the valley from you anymore. I don't want Saturday evenings and Wednesday afternoons. I want to wake up knowing you're in the same house. I want to know that you'll be there when things are hard and when they're good and when they're ordinary, which is most of the time. I want to build something with you. I want to spend the rest of my life learning who you are." He paused. "I have a ring. I had it made in Pueblo in November. I just meant to wait for a better moment, and then I realized that any moment with you is the right moment, and I didn't want to plan it anymore." He found the ring in his coat pocket. It was gold, simple, with a small inset of turquoise that had come from a piece of stone Thomas Waxfar had given him when he told Thomas what he was planning, saying only that it was for good fortune in the old way. She looked at the ring. She looked at him. She said, "You've had that ring since November." He said, "Since November 7th. She said, "That was 6 weeks ago." He said, "I know," she said. "You've been coming to supper every week for 6 weeks with a ring in your pocket." He said, "Yes," she said, "Elias Doyle." He said, "Elsie Sullivan." She took the ring from his hand. She said, "Yes, obviously yes, emphatically yes. How could you not know that the answer was yes?" He said, "I was afraid." She said, "We established that you are frequently afraid." He said, "You make me braver." She put the ring on her own finger because she was a practical woman, and he was fumbling with his gloves, and she looked at it for a moment. And then she looked at him with those storm-colored eyes full of something that was no longer divided or guarded or working to contain itself. Something simple and enormous and entirely unafraid. She kissed him. On the frozen creek bank in the January cold, with the cottonwoods bare and white above them and the mountains blue in the distance, she kissed him with everything she had not been saying for 6 years, and he kissed her back the same way. And it was exactly like the thing that had been building between them since 1877, which was to say it was enormous and obvious and had been, to anyone with eyes, completely inevitable. Miss Sullivan cried when they told her. She cried the productive, jubilant kind of tears that are really just joy with nowhere else to go. And she hugged Elsie for a long time, and then she hugged Elias and said, "I told her. I told her for years that she needed to stop being so quiet." "Did she tell you about the lamp in the window?" Elias said. "She told me." Me said, "I lit that lamp the first 3 times. After that she did it herself." Elsie said, Me said, "A mother is allowed to manage certain things." Elias laughed. Elsie said with enormous dignity, "I refuse to be embarrassed." She was not embarrassed. She was laughing too, and me was laughing, and the Sullivan kitchen was full of it, warm and real, and carrying 6 years of careful silence out the window all at once. Ruth and Harvey came from a limosa with baby Patrick for the engagement dinner 2 weeks later. Ruth was warm and pretty and completely unsurprised, which she said as the very first thing when she walked through the door, looking at Elias and saying, "Finally. Elsie has been in love with you since approximately 1879, and I was sworn to secrecy, and it has been genuinely difficult." Elsie said, Ruth." Ruth said, "He should know." Elias said, 1879. Elsie said, "She exaggerates." Ruth said, "I absolutely do not. She read Jane Eyre 4 times in 1879. Elias looked at Elsie with something in his eyes that was entirely too warm to argue with. Elsie said, "It is a good book." He said, "It is." She pointed at the baby in Harvey's arms and said, "Can we talk about Patrick? He has Patrick Sullivan's eyebrows." Everyone looked at baby Patrick, who did indeed have extraordinary eyebrows for a 3-month-old. The evening was long and good and full of the kind of easy, overlapping conversation that happens when people who genuinely like each other are together. And at the end of it, when Ruth and Harvey had gone to bed in the back room and me had retired and Elsie and Elias were alone in the kitchen again, she said, 1879. He said, 1879. She said, "I was 19. You came to help with the harvest that year and you stayed for 3 days and you never once made me feel like you were there to look at me. You were just there to work." And I thought very clearly, this is a man who sees work as the real thing, the actual thing, and I thought that was remarkable. He said, I was looking at you the whole time. She said, I know, but you were also working. He said, I thought about you every single day of those 3 years in Denver. She said, what did you think? He said, I thought about your hands when you work. The way you solve problems before other people have finished identifying them. The way you laugh when something is genuinely funny and not when something is just polite. He paused. I thought about what it would be like to come home to you. She reached across the table and took his hand. She said, you're home. They were married on the 15th of April, 1884. The wedding was held at the First Baptist Church, which had the benefit of being large enough and the complication of being presided over by Reverend Marsh, who was a good man but somewhat overfond of extended homilies, and Elsie had, in the week before the wedding, extracted from him a promise that the ceremony would be under 45 minutes, which he agreed to and very nearly kept. The church was full. Sweetwater turned out completely, partly from genuine affection for both of them and partly from the powerful communal satisfaction of watching something that the whole valley had been waiting for finally arrive. Clara Whitfield was there in the same blue silk, visibly happy for them in the generous way of a woman who has decided that a good outcome is a good outcome regardless of her own hopes. Agnes Hargrove was there too, seated beside her father, and if she felt any particular way about the preserves she had given Elias at the harvest dance being present at his wedding table, she gave no outward sign of it. Thomas Wauxfar stood at the front of the church beside Elias, as the closest thing to a brother Elias had, wearing his good jacket and a look of contained, profound satisfaction. Sarah Wauxfar was in the front pew, 3 months pregnant, watching her husband watch his best friend get married, and her expression was the expression of a woman who understands exactly what this day means to everyone in it. Miss Sullivan walked Elsie down the aisle. Elsie wore her mother's wedding dress, altered and cleaned and pressed, cream-colored silk that had crossed the plains in a trunk in 1868, and had waited in a cedar chest for 15 years to walk down another aisle. She wore her hair pinned up in the way she had, with small flowers Ruth had braided in at dawn that morning, and she walked steadily and without hesitation, and when she saw Elias at the front of the church she did not look away. He did not look away either. He never had. The ceremony was 38 minutes, which Reverend Marsh considered a personal triumph and Elsie considered entirely reasonable, and when Elias said, I do, it was with the complete, unambiguous certainty of a man who has been saying it to himself for 6 years and is delighted to finally say it out loud. And when Elsie said it, it was with the same completeness, the same total, resolved, unguarded certainty. He kissed her. The church erupted. Ruth, somewhere in the pews, could be heard saying something enthusiastic that Harvey would later describe as spirited. The reception was at the Grange Hall, the same floor where they had eaten corn cake in October, and he had asked if he could call on her properly, and she had said yes, and it was transformed by Miss Sullivan and Ruth, and approximately 11 other women of Sweetwater who had spent 2 days arranging paper flowers and cottonwood branches, and setting out enough food to sustain a cattle drive. Elias danced with his wife. It was the first time they had danced together, in the very hall where they had eaten cake 6 months ago instead of dancing, and she was a better dancer than he expected, which she told him was because Patrick Sullivan had believed dancing was a necessary life skill, and had taught both daughters in the kitchen every Sunday evening from the time they could walk, and he danced with her to a waltz played by the same fiddle player from the harvest dance, and he thought, specifically, about the waltz that had been playing when he sat down across from her in October, and she had said he had until the waltz ended, and he thought about how that waltz had ended and a different one had begun. He said, I want to tell you something. She said, I know. He said, you don't know this. She said, tell me. He said, every woman in this town has given me reason to notice her. Every single one of them, for different reasons and in different ways, has done something to put herself in front of me. And I have noticed all of them in the way you notice things that are around you. He paused. But you never gave me a single reason, and I could not stop noticing you. From the first evening I walked into your father's kitchen, every single day since then. He looked at her. That is the most accurate thing I know about myself, that I love you without needing a reason. Elsie Sullivan, who was now Elsie Doyle, who had been self-contained and practical and careful and quiet for longer than anyone should have to be, looked at her husband in the lamplight of the Sweetwater Grange hall and felt the last wall come down, cleanly and completely, like a fence you no longer need because what you were protecting is safe. She said, "I lit the lamp the first night, Elias, the very first Saturday, before you even asked to come back." He said, "You told me lit it the first 3 times." She said, "Me lit it later in the evening. I had already lit it before supper." He held her tighter. He said, "You were waiting." She said, "I was always waiting. I just didn't know how to stop pretending I wasn't." He said, "You don't have to pretend anything anymore." She said, "I know." She put her head against his shoulder. They danced. The hall was bright and loud and full of people they loved, and the mountains were dark and permanent outside, and the creek ran cold and steady through the valley, and it was April of 1884, and everything they had built was just beginning. They moved into the Doyle Creek Ranch house together. It was a good house. Elias had expanded it in the years since the original one-room cabin, and what stood now was a 2-story frame structure with a wide front porch and a kitchen large enough to work in, and a sitting room where bookshelves occupied an entire wall because Elsie had said, the first week, that she would need bookshelves, and Elias had agreed with the enthusiasm of a man who has been waiting to be asked. The bookshelves were the first sign. The second sign was the account books. Elsie looked at the ranch's financial records on the first Tuesday after their wedding and said nothing for 40 minutes while she read and made small notes in the margin, and Elias sat across from her and pretended to read something himself. She said eventually, "You've been paying a premium on your winter feed supply for 3 years." He said, "I know. The supplier in Pueblo is the closest." She said, "There's a supplier in Trinidad who would cost 30% less for the same feed grade." "I know because the Hartley farm switched to him in 1882. He said, "All right," she said, "I'll write to him Monday." He said, "Elsie." She looked up. He said, "I'm going to need you to know that this is one of the most genuinely attractive things that has ever happened to me." She looked at him for a moment. She said, "You are a very unusual man." He said, "I have been told." She went back to the account books, but there was a smile happening in the corner of her mouth that she was visibly choosing not to fully deploy, and he watched it and felt warm all the way down. Summer arrived and the ranch was in its full rhythm, which was enormous and consuming an entirely Elias world, and which became, within 2 months, entirely Elsie's world too, not because she subsumed herself into it, but because she brought herself to it, which was different. She did not stop helping families in the valley. She continued her careful correspondence with the Attorney Cross in Pueblo. She organized the school supply drive again, and this time got the county to supplement it, which involved a letter to the county superintendent that Elias later described as the most precisely devastating piece of correspondence he had ever read, and which Elsie described as simply accurate. But she was also a rancher's wife. She learned the cattle operation with the same focused, systematic intelligence she applied to everything. She could read the health of a herd in the way the animals moved. She understood the grazing rotation and the winter feed calculation and the economics of the cattle market well enough that by August she was sitting in on every contract negotiation Elias had, not as decoration, but as a genuine second voice who caught things he missed. Thomas Waxfar, who had managed the ranch for 7 years and had been Elias' most trusted person in all that time, recognized in Elsie someone of comparable quality and treated her accordingly from the beginning, which Elias noticed and was grateful for. Sarah Waxfar and Elsie became friends. Real friends, the kind that form between women who respect each other without needing to be careful about it. They were different in many ways, Sarah having grown up in a Ute community before moving into the valley's mixed world as an adult navigating spaces that did not always make room for her, with the particular dignified patience of someone who has had to teach themselves to take up space by force of internal conviction. But they shared a directness and a competence, and a very similar sense of what was worth worrying about and what was not. In September of 1884, Sarah Wachsfar gave birth to a son. They named him Henry, which was Thomas's father's name. He was strong and loud from the first hour. Elsie held him in the Wachsfar house while Sarah rested, and she felt something that she had felt abstractly before and now felt with considerable specificity. She came home and told Elias. She said, not with drama but with the simple directness she brought to all important things, "I'd like to start trying for a family." He said, "I have been trying not to bring it up because I didn't want to pressure you." She said, "You can bring things up. That's allowed." He said, "All right." She said, "All right." He said, "Yes, all right. I would like nothing in the world more than to have a family with you." She looked at him. She said, "Then stop standing over there." He crossed the room. The summer of 1885 arrived with long, warm days and a valley that felt, to Elias Doyle, like the exact version of itself that he had been working toward for 8 years. And in late June, Elsie came to find him in the south pasture where he was helping Thomas repair a section of fence that the spring flooding had undermined. She walked across the field toward him. He saw her coming from 100 yards and stopped working. Thomas looked at Elsie's face and then at Elias and said, "I'll get more wire," and walked away in the deliberate manner of a man who is choosing not to witness something private. She stopped in front of him. She said, "I've confirmed it with the doctor." "Confirmed," she said. "We're expecting a baby." He stood there for a moment with a fence post in his hands, and then he put the fence post down very carefully against the nearest fence rail and crossed the distance between them in 3 steps and held her. She let herself be held. She put her arms around him and she could feel his heart going fast through his shirt, and she thought quite clearly that this was what she had been protecting herself from for so many years. Not pain, not loss. This exact flooding, immense, terrifying gladness. He said into her hair, "Are you all right?" She said, "I am extraordinarily all right." He said, "Good, that's very good." He was still holding the fence wire in one hand. He did not notice until Thomas came back and pointed it out. The pregnancy was good. Not easy, which nothing real is, but good. Elsie continued working, because she was not a woman who stopped working. But she let Elias take on more of the heavier account work, and she let me, who had come to stay at the ranch house for the final 2 months, fuss over her in the way me needed to fuss. And she let Ruth write her extremely long letters full of very specific advice about childbirth that were partly helpful and partly terrifying. The baby was born in February of 1886. A boy. 7 pounds, 4 ounces, delivered by the valley's doctor, a reliable man named George Marsh, who was no relation to the Reverend, on a cold Tuesday morning with snow falling lightly outside the bedroom window. Elias was present for all of it and did not disgrace himself, which he considered a significant personal achievement, given that he spent most of it in a state of controlled panic. When the doctor put the baby in his arms, Elias looked down at this small, red-faced, extraordinarily opinionated person who was objecting loudly to the experience of existing, and he felt something that reorganized everything he thought he knew about himself. He looked at Elsie, who was exhausted and pale and watching him with those storm-colored eyes. He said, "He has your eyes," she said. "He's red and screaming." He said, "Underneath that, he has your eyes." She said, "What do we call him?" They had discussed names for 3 months. He said, James Patrick Doyle." She said, "After my father." He said, "After your father, who fed me when I was too proud to say I was hungry." She reached up and touched his face with one hand, the way she had on the dance floor at their wedding, completely and unhesitatingly. She said, "James Patrick Doyle." James Patrick Doyle screamed his approval. Miss Sullivan held him next and wept the productive, jubilant tears. Thomas and Sarah Wachsfar came to meet him the following week, and Henry, who was 16 months old and enormously opinionated about the world, regarded James with the imperial suspicion of a firstborn confronting a potential rival, and then decided with visible magnanimity that the baby was acceptable. The years that followed were not simple. They were not supposed to be. The cattle market went through a difficult period in 1886 and 1887, as it did across the whole of the Plains and Mountain West, as the great cattle boom of the early decade overcorrected and prices fell sharply. Elias and Elsie spent many evenings that winter with the account book spread between them at the kitchen table, making the kind of difficult calculations that are the real work of building something lasting. They sold off a section of the northern range that was the least productive and used the proceeds to carry the herd through the low market. They renegotiated contracts. They diversified into a small grain operation that Elsie had been suggesting since the previous year. It was hard. It did not break them. Nothing about it broke them, because they had built something that was based on truth rather than convenience. And the truth held up under pressure the way well-joined timber holds up in a flood. By 1888, the market had stabilized, and the Doyle Creek operation was in better shape than before the downturn, partly because of the decisions they had made under pressure and partly because Elsie had spent the difficult years building relationships and systems that paid dividends long after the immediate crisis passed. James was 2, and then 3, and then a sturdy, curious, dark-haired boy who followed Thomas Walksfar around the ranch with the devotion of a small shadow. He had Elsie's eyes and Elias' stubbornness, and a laugh that belonged to neither of them but felt like the best of both. In the summer of 1889, when James was 3 and Colorado was becoming a state, which was a matter of enormous conversation and celebration in Sweetwater and everywhere else in the territory, Elsie told Elias over breakfast that she thought they might be expanding their family again. He said, "The statehood celebration is this weekend." She said, "The baby and the statehood celebration are not in direct competition, Elias." He said, "I know. I am simply establishing a timeline," she said. "Is that what you're doing?" He put his coffee down. He said, "Are you well? Are you happy? Is everything all right?" She said, "I am very well and very happy and everything is entirely all right." He said, "Then everything is entirely all right," she said. "You're doing that thing where your voice gets very steady because you're actually very moved." He said, "I have no idea what you're talking about." She said, "You've done it since the corn cake at the harvest dance." He said, "I'm a steady person." She said, "You are. It's one of the things I love about you." She reached across the breakfast table and took his hand. "We're going to need the bigger bedroom cleared out before spring." He said, "I'll start on the extension tomorrow." She said, "The extension can wait until fall." He said, "I'm starting tomorrow." She looked at him. She said, "You are an impossible man." He said, "You knew that when you married me." She said, "I had significant evidence, yes." He started the bedroom extension the following week. Thomas helped, and Henry Walksfar, who was 5 and extremely interested in construction, supervised with the authority of someone who had not been asked to. Colorado became a state in August of 1889, and there was a celebration in Sweetwater that lasted 3 days, and involved more corn cake than Elias would ever be able to think about neutrally. And Elsie stood on the Grange Hall steps with James on her hip and her hand in Elias, and watched the valley celebrate, and felt the particular, deep satisfaction of a woman who is exactly where she is supposed to be. Ruth and Harvey came up from a Lamosa for the celebration with Patrick, who was 5 and full of the specific energy of a 5-year-old boy experiencing his first significant public celebration, and with their new daughter, born that spring, named Me, which made the original Me Sullivan cry the productive jubilant tears a 3rd time. Me Sullivan was 71 and slowing down in the visible way now, but she was still sharp and still utterly without subtlety about her opinions and still the center of gravity of the Sullivan family. And she sat in the best chair at the celebration table and held baby Me and looked around at the table full of people she loved and said, with the composure of a woman who has earned the right to say exactly what she thinks, "I am satisfied." Elias looked at her. She said, "I did not always think this is what would happen. After Patrick died, I thought for a while that I would just be the end of something, the last generation of a family that had started something and run out of room." She paused. "I was wrong," Elsie said. Me said, "I'm allowed to be right sometimes. I was right about the lamp." Elsie said, "You were right about the lamp," me said, "and I was right about Elias Doyle." Elias said, "What were you right about me?" Me said, "That you were the kind of man who would still be here in 20 years and would be better for it, that you were worth the difficulty." He said, "Elsie was the one worth the difficulty." Me said, "I know that. I'm talking about the difficulty from my perspective." Everyone at the table laughed. James laughed because everyone else was laughing. Elias looked at Elsie. She was looking at him. She had the expression she had when something was entirely true and entirely good, and she did not need to say anything about it because it simply was. He reached under the table and found her hand. She turned her palm up and laced her fingers through his, the way she had the first time, at the Sullivan kitchen table, the 4th Saturday after the harvest dance, with me asleep in the rocking chair. He thought, as he had thought many times and never tired of thinking, that he had spent 6 years watching every woman in Sweetwater notice him with varying degrees of artfulness and calculation and genuine warmth, and none of them had ever done to him what Elsie Sullivan had done simply by looking away. By being so entirely herself that there was no performance and no strategy, only the real person, with her coffee going cold and her refolded letter and her lamp in the window that she had lit before he was even on the road. The second child was born in the spring of 1890, a girl. She came into the world with considerably less objection than James had, which the doctor said simply meant she had a calmer temperament, and which James said nothing about because he was 4 and had been told a baby was coming for several months, and had formulated very specific theories about what that would mean. They named her Clara. Not after Clara Whitfield, though Clara Whitfield, who was by now happily married to the bank's new clerk and had been a genuine friend to both of them for years, was visibly moved when she heard the name. Clara had been Elias' mother's name. The grandmother who had made the drive from Tennessee to New Mexico in 1855, and who had kept the family together through losses that would have undone lesser people, and who had told her son, Elias' father before she died, that the best thing a man could do was be present for the people who needed him. Elias had told Elsie that story in the first winter they were married. She had remembered it. She had chosen the name. He had not been able to speak for a full minute when she told him why. Clara Doyle was a calm, bright, observant baby who grew into a calm, bright, observant child who at the age of 2 followed her mother around the kitchen with the focused attention of a scholar, and at the age of 3 could identify every cattle brand in the valley by sight. She had Elias' dark blonde hair and a mouth that smiled sideways in exactly the way Elsie's did when something was genuinely funny. James was devoted to her. He was a good brother, protective and bossy in equal measure, which Elsie said was perfectly appropriate for a 4-year-old, and which Elias said would require monitoring. James said, when asked about his sister at the age of 5, that she was satisfactory, which Miss Sullivan took as a direct genetic inheritance from Elsie, and which everyone else found entirely too accurate to argue with. The ranch grew, not recklessly, steadily, with the methodical, patient intelligence that was the combined product of Elias' cattle sense and frontier tenacity and Elsie's financial precision and organizational mind. By 1892, the Doyle Creek Ranch employed 7 full-time hands, had established a grain operation that supplied 3 other ranches in the valley, and had developed a reputation across the territory as a well-run and fair operation that treated its employees and its neighbors with equal consideration. Thomas Waxfar was the ranch's foreman in all but title, and the title came in 1892 when Elias formalized it in a conversation that Thomas said was unnecessary and that Elias said was the point. Thomas said, "I've been doing this work for 12 years. Elias said, "I know. This is the part where I say that out loud where it counts. Thomas said, you never cared about titles. Elias said, Elsie says some things that have been true need to be said out loud where they count. She's usually right. Thomas looked at him. He said, she is usually right. Elias said, I know. Sarah Walksfar and Henry had added 2 more children by 1892. Henry had a brother named Joseph and a sister named Ada, and the Walksfar children and the Doyle children grew up together on the ranch in the particular, complicated, closely bonded way of children who share a home territory and none of whom have ever been told they shouldn't. There were hard years. There were the winters that tested everything. There were the market downturns and the one drought that took 2 years to recover from, and the year a disease went through the northern herd, and they lost more cattle than Elias had lost since his first year in the valley. And those losses required decisions and sacrifices, and the kind of sustained effort that strips away everything that is not essential and leaves only what is real. What was real always was the kitchen table. Them together, with the account books or the letters or the maps, or sometimes nothing at all. Just coffee and the fire and the particular, unguarded ease of 2 people who have stopped pretending to be anything except exactly who they are. Elsie never stopped reading. She went through the books on that full wall of shelves with a steady, voracious appetite that Elias supplemented every time he went to Pueblo or Denver, bringing back novels and historical accounts and legal texts and agricultural journals with the careful attention of someone who has learned exactly what feeds the person they love. He also continued to bring her coffee, every morning without fail. She took it every morning without asking where it came from, with the ease of a woman who has finally, fully allowed herself to receive something without needing to justify it or repay it or call it a debt. That, he sometimes thought, was the real sign. Not the ring or the wedding or the children or the lamp in the window, that she took the coffee. Miss Sullivan died in the spring of 1893. She died as she had lived, which was on her own terms and with the specific satisfaction of a woman who had seen what she needed to see and done what she needed to do. She died in the ranch house bedroom that had been hers since the winter after the wedding, when Elsie had made her come out of the farmhouse and live with them, not asking but simply arriving with the buckboard and informing me that the matter was decided. Me had said, I haven't said yes. Elsie had said, you also haven't said no. She had been at the ranch for 4 years. She had held both grandchildren an enormous number of times. She had told Elias exactly what she thought about everything, on a regular basis, with great thoroughness, and he had listened to all of it with genuine attention. And she had, in the last year, begun calling him my boy with the proprietorial warmth of a woman who has decided that adoption, like most important things, is a matter of decision rather than circumstance. Elsie sat with her mother on the last day and held her hand. She said at the end, you were right about everything. Me said, I was right about most things. Elsie said, most things. Me said, the lamp was my idea. Elsie said, I lit it first. Me smiled. She said, yes, you did. They buried her on the ridge above the ranch where the view of the mountains was clear and permanent, and where Patrick Sullivan's marker had stood since they moved it from the valley plot the spring after the wedding, because Elsie had wanted them to be together and facing something worth looking at. Ruth came from a Lamosa. They stood at the ridge, all of them, Ruth and Harvey and Patrick and young me, and Elias and Elsie and James and Clara, and Thomas and Sarah with Henry and Joseph and Ada, and the mountains were very blue in the April light and the wind was soft. Elsie did not fall apart. She cried, which was different. She stood with her husband's arm around her and her daughter's hand in her hand, and she cried for her mother, who had given her a lamp and a kitchen and a father who danced, and a whole life that had led, through grief and pride and cowardice and courage, and a waltz at the harvest dance, to this exact ridge with these exact people under this exact sky. She cried, and she did not try to stop. Elias held her and said nothing, because he had learned that the best thing he could do in the moments when Elsie finally let herself feel something was to be there without qualification and without commentary, just present, just real. James stood beside his father with his hand in Elias' free hand, looking at the mountains the way a 7-year-old looks at things that are large and final and not yet fully understood, and Clara stood against her mother's side with her calm, observant eyes taking in everything. They planted wildflower seeds over Me's grave before they left the ridge. They came back that August and the flowers were blooming. Life continued. James started school in Sweetwater that fall and was, by all accounts, a child of considerable intelligence, who expressed that intelligence primarily through asking questions that the teacher, a patient man named Mr. Briggs, found genuinely challenging. Clara, at 3, had opinions about this and communicated them primarily through the eloquent medium of expression. Elsie finished a project she had been working on since 1890, which was a comprehensive guide to the water rights and land survey precedents in the valley, compiled from all the cases she had helped argue over the previous decade, organized into a clear reference document that she had printed at the Pueblo Press and distributed to every landowning family in the valley and sent to the county courthouse as a permanent record. The county superintendent wrote her a letter. She framed it. Elias said, "You framed the letter," she said. "It's a good letter." He said, "You have never framed anything before," she said. "I have never done something before that warranted framing." He said, "You have done many extraordinary things," she said. "This one is official." She paused. "My father would have liked it." He looked at the framed letter on the kitchen wall next to the shelf of books. He said, "He would have been incredibly proud of you." She said, "Of us." He said, "Of us." By the middle of the decade, Sweetwater had grown. The railroad had come through the valley in 1891, changing everything the way railroads always changed everything, bringing new people and new commerce and new complexity. The town had a proper hotel now and a lawyer's office and a second church, Methodist, which created gentle denominational politics that Elsie found mildly amusing and which Reverend Marsh found somewhat less amusing. The ranch adapted to the railroad with the same systematic intelligence it had always applied to change. Direct contracts with Denver and beyond. Better prices. More predictable markets. The grain operation expanded. The cattle operation, always the core, remained the core, but was now supported by a diversification that meant no single bad year could undo what they had built. Elias was 41 in 1895. Elsie was 35. They sat on the front porch of the ranch house one evening in September with the mountains going dark amber in the late light, and James inside doing his schoolwork badly and loudly, and Clara beside him doing her schoolwork well and silently, and the sounds of Thomas and Sarah's children in the yard to the north, and the cattle settling in the far pasture, and Elias said, without preface, "Do you remember what you said to me at the harvest dance? About the world keeping moving and making new things?" She said, "I remember," he said. "I think about it sometimes, about how still I was before that night. How I had built all of this and I had everything I needed except the courage to sit down across from you," she said. "You were quite dramatic about it, coming all the way across the floor to tell me about the corn cake." He said, "I had been working up to it for years." She said, "I know." He said, "You never made it easy." She said, "I know." He said, "It was the best thing about it." She turned to look at him. She said, "I was not trying to make it difficult." He said, "I know. You were just being yourself. That was the whole of it. That was the thing that made it impossible to walk away from." She said, "Elias." He said, "Yes." She said, "Every single day I am glad you walked across that floor." He said, "Every single day." The evening settled around them, warm and full. He reached over and found her hand. She took it without looking, the way you take something that has been yours long enough to find in the dark. They sat together on the porch of the Doyle Creek Ranch until the light was gone and the stars were out and the mountains were black against the sky, and the valley below them held everything they had built and everyone they loved, and the creek ran steadily in the dark, and it was exactly, precisely, wholly enough. 3 years later, in 1898, there was a third child. Another boy, which James declared appropriate, and Clara declared interesting in the way she declared most things, which was with an economy of expression that had been hers from the first hour. They named him Patrick Robert Doyle. Patrick for Elsie's father, Robert for Elias' older brother who had died in New Mexico before Elias came to Colorado, the loss that Elias had never quite put down but had learned to carry in the way you learn to carry the permanent things. Patrick Robert was from the beginning a different creature than either James or Clara. He was exuberant and reckless and possessed of an energy that made the house feel smaller in the best possible way. He laughed immediately and freely at everything, and was from the age of 2 genuinely beloved by everyone on the ranch, because it was simply impossible not to be moved by the completeness of his joy in being alive. Elias looked at this youngest child sometimes with the full weight of everything that had happened before him, all the years of silence and distance and difficulty, and felt the particular grace of late gifts. The things that come after the hardest part, when you have already proven that you will stay regardless. James was 12 when Patrick was born and was a fine young man in training, already helping full days on the ranch in the summers with the natural ease of a boy who has grown up with the work and never been required to separate himself from it. He had Elsie's precision and Elias' endurance, and Thomas Wauxfar said, with the considered authority of someone who knew cattle, that James would be an exceptional rancher. Elsie said, "He'll be what he wants to be." Thomas said, "He wants to be a rancher." Elsie said, "Then he'll be an excellent one." Clara was 12 in 1902 and had become, in the quiet way she did most things, the most widely read person on the Doyle Creek Ranch, including her mother, which Elsie considered a genuine achievement and Elias considered entirely expected. She had decided at 10 that she wanted to be a teacher, and at 12 she was already the informal instructor of Henry and Joseph and Ada Wauxfar in the subjects the Sweetwater school had not gotten to yet, and Mr. Briggs, who had taught James and now taught Clara and would eventually teach Patrick, said she had the finest analytical mind he had encountered in 20 years of teaching. Henry Wauxfar was 18 in 1902 and was his father's son in the best possible way, steady and capable and possessed of Thomas's gift for understanding land and animals at an almost instinctive level. He and James were inseparable in the way of boys who have grown up as brothers without the label, and their friendship was, Elias thought, one of the things he was most proud of about the ranch, that it had made space for that it was the kind of place where that was simply true. In the fall of 1902, Elias and Elsie celebrated their 18th wedding anniversary. Ruth came up from a limosa with her family. Patrick Sullivan Cole was 18 and a serious-faced young man studying law in Pueblo. Young me Cole was 12 and had the Sullivan eyes and an opinion about everything. They had dinner at the long table on the ranch house porch because the evening was warm enough and the table inside was not large enough for the whole gathering. Elias looked down the table at all of it, James and Henry arguing about the best cutting horse on the property, Clara listening to the argument and visibly computing who was wrong. Young me and little Patrick Robert, who was 4, engaged in a project involving pine cones that seemed to have significant purpose. Thomas and Sarah closed together at the far end, the ease of 2 people who have been building something alongside each other for 2 decades. Ruth and Harvey, settled and real, and Elsie at his left talking to Ruth about a letter she had received from the county regarding a new homestead filing dispute that she was already planning to address. She caught him looking. She said mid-sentence to Ruth without breaking her explanation. "What?" he said. "Nothing." She said, "You're doing the thing." Ruth said, "What thing?" Elsie said, "The thing where he just looks at me." Ruth said, "He's always done that." Elsie said, "Since 1877, apparently." Ruth said, "Since before that. I saw him watch you split firewood once when you didn't know he was there, and I thought, oh, that man is completely done for." Elias said, "I'm right here." Ruth said, "I know." Elias looked at his wife. She looked at him with those storm-colored eyes that had been at the center of everything for 25 years, and they were still unresolved, still charged, still the most interesting weather he had ever stood in. And she smiled at him with the sideways smile that was entirely hers, the one that belonged to him by the extraordinary good fortune of walking across a dance floor in October of 1883. He said, 25 years. She said, 18 since the wedding. He said, 25 since the corn cake. She said, it was technically my first time telling you something true. He said, it was a magnificent moment. She said, it was corn cake. He said, you know what I mean. She put her hand over his on the table. She said, I know what you mean. The table was loud and warm and full. The mountains were there, permanent and blue, the same mountains that had been there the night he walked across the Grange Hall floor and pulled out a chair without asking. The same mountains above me Sullivan's ridge with the wildflowers. The same mountains under which Patrick Sullivan had farmed for 20 years and Elias had driven 47 cattle north in a move that was either brave or foolish and turned out to be both. The creek ran. The cattle were in the pasture. The books were on the shelves. The lamp was always lit. Elsie Sullivan, who had become Elsie Doyle, who had been careful and quiet and self-contained and alone for longer than was right, and who had finally, irrevocably, entirely stopped pretending she did not need what she had always needed, sat with her husband's hand under hers at a table full of the people they had made and kept and loved, and she was not performing anything. She was simply there. Wholly, completely, unhiddenly there. That was the thing. That had always been the thing. He had known it from the first moment she told him to wash his hands at the basin outside because there was soap, and he had been unable to look at anything else since, and he never would be, and he was, to the bottom of his fortunate and deeply contented soul, entirely glad. The lantern on the porch swayed in the evening wind. Nobody put it out. It burned all night.